For 3 years, Matthew Perry secretly paid for 200 people's addiction treatment. His accountant had no idea until he found $2.3 million in mysterious payments. When the truth came out, it revealed the most incredible act of silent generosity ever recorded. David Chen had been managing celebrity finances for over 15 years when Matthew Perry became his client in 2018, but he had never encountered anything quite like what he discovered in March 2022. As Matthew's certified public accountant, David was responsible for tracking every dollar that came in and went out of Matthew's various accounts, and he prided himself on maintaining meticulous records that could account for every expense, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. That's why the pattern he noticed while reviewing Matthew's 2021 tax documents struck him as so unusual. Scattered throughout the year were dozens of payments to medical facilities, treatment centers, and organizations that David had never heard of before. The payments varied in size. Some were $15,000, others were $50,000, a few were as large as $100,000, but they all shared certain characteristics that made them stand out from Matthew's typical expenses. First, they were all made to facilities that specialized in addiction treatment and mental health services. Second, they were all labeled in Matthew's banking records as anonymous donations or charitable contributions, but they weren't going to any of the established charities that Matthew regularly supported. Third, and most puzzling, they were spread across the entire country, facilities in Ohio, Texas, Arizona, Florida, Colorado, Washington, and at least a dozen other states. David's initial assumption was that these payments represented some kind of new charitable initiative that Matthew had undertaken, possibly related to his own recovery journey. But when he tried to organize the payments for tax purposes, he realized that the total amount involved was far larger than he had initially calculated. After careful analysis, David determined that Matthew had made 127 separate payments to 89 different facilities over the course of 2021, totaling just over $1.8 million. This wasn't just charitable giving. This was systematic, large-scale funding of addiction treatment services across multiple states, and it had been happening without any consultation with David about the tax implications or documentation requirements. "Matthew," David said during their quarterly financial review meeting in March 2022, "I need to ask you about some significant expenses I found while preparing your tax returns. You've donated almost $2 million to addiction treatment facilities last year, and I don't have any of the proper documentation for these charitable deductions." Matthew's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of the casual acknowledgement David expected, Matthew became visibly uncomfortable, shifting in his chair and avoiding eye contact. "What kind of documentation do you need?" Matthew asked, his voice tight with what sounded like anxiety. "The standard stuff," David replied. "Receipts showing that these organizations are qualified 501c3 charities, acknowledgement letters confirming the donations, records showing what services or programs your money supported, basic charity documentation that we need for the IRS." Matthew was quiet for a long moment before saying, "What if I told you that these weren't exactly traditional charitable donations?" David felt a familiar sinking feeling that he associated with clients who were about to reveal financial complications. "Matthew, please tell me you weren't involved in some kind of tax avoidance scheme. Because if these payments weren't legitimate charitable contributions, we have a serious problem." No, nothing like that," Matthew said quickly. "The payments are completely legitimate. It's just that, well, they're not donations to organizations. They're payments for specific people's treatment." This explanation only confused David more. "You mean you've been directly paying for individual people's rehab, like people you know personally?" Matthew shook his head. "People I've never met. Strangers who couldn't afford treatment and were going to go without help if someone didn't pay for them." David stared at Matthew for several seconds, trying to process what he was hearing. "You're telling me you spent almost $2 million last year paying for strangers' addiction treatment?" "It started smaller than that," Matthew said, finally meeting David's eyes. "But yes, that's what I've been doing." Over the next hour, Matthew explained to David a system he had been operating in secret for over 3 years. It had started in late 2019 when Matthew had met a woman named Sarah at an AA meeting who was desperate to get her teenage son into rehab but couldn't afford the cost of residential treatment. Matthew had quietly paid the $45,000 for the boy's 90-day program, asking only that Sarah never tell anyone where the money had come from. That single act of generosity had led to what Matthew described as an addiction, not to substances, but to the feeling of being able to solve problems for people who were struggling with the same disease that had nearly killed him multiple times. "I started asking around at meetings," Matthew explained. "Not obviously, just listening to people talk about their struggles, their families, their barriers to getting help. And I realized that money was the biggest obstacle for so many people. Not motivation, not willingness to get clean, just money. Matthew had developed a network of contacts, therapists, social workers, treatment center admissions coordinators, and recovery advocates, who would discreetly let him know about individuals who needed help but couldn't afford it. He had established a set of criteria. The person had to want treatment but be unable to pay for it. They had to have exhausted other funding options, and they had to agree to a payment plan that would allow them to contribute something, even if it was just $50 a month, so they maintained some investment in their recovery. I never wanted people to think it was free money, Matthew explained. I wanted them to have skin in the game, to feel like they were earning their recovery. So we always set up payment plans where they would pay back whatever they could afford, even if it was practically nothing. David was simultaneously amazed and concerned by what he was hearing. The scope of what Matthew had been doing was incredible. He had essentially been operating his own private addiction treatment funding program, but the lack of documentation and oversight created serious financial and legal risks. Matthew, this is incredible, but we need to formalize this somehow, David said. You can't just be making anonymous payments to treatment facilities without proper records. What if someone accuses you of money laundering? What if the IRS decides these payments aren't deductible? What if one of these facilities is fraudulent and you're inadvertently funding something illegal? Matthew nodded, acknowledging these concerns. I know it's not the most organized system, but I was afraid that if I made it too official, too public, it would change the nature of what I was trying to do. I didn't want people to know it was me helping them, because I didn't want their recovery to be about gratitude to me. I wanted it to be about them getting healthy. This motivation impressed David, but didn't address the practical problems they were facing. He suggested that they work together to create a more structured approach that would maintain Matthew's anonymity while providing the documentation and oversight needed to protect him legally and financially. Over the following weeks, David helped Matthew establish the Anonymous Recovery Fund, a private foundation that would handle the administrative aspects of his treatment funding while maintaining the privacy and personal connection that Matthew valued. David also worked backward through Matthew's records to document all the payments he had made since 2019, contacting facilities to obtain proper receipts and verification that the money had been used appropriately. The process of documenting Matthew's 3 years of secret generosity revealed the true scope of what he had accomplished. Between January 2020 and March 2022, Matthew had funded addiction treatment for 203 individuals across 127 different facilities in 34 states. The total amount he had spent was $2.3 million, making him one of the largest private funders of addiction treatment services in the country, despite the fact that no one outside of David's office knew he was doing it. But the numbers only told part of the story. David insisted on contacting some of the treatment facilities to verify that the payments had been properly applied and that the people who had received help were aware they could provide testimonials for tax purposes. What David learned from these conversations fundamentally changed his understanding of what Matthew had accomplished. The director of a treatment facility in Colorado told David about a young mother who had been on their waiting list for 8 months because she couldn't afford treatment. Matthew's payment had allowed her to enter residential care immediately, and she had been sober for 2 years since completing the program. She now worked as a peer counselor at the same facility. A program coordinator in Florida described a military veteran who had been living on the streets because he couldn't afford both housing and addiction treatment. Matthew's funding had covered 6 months of residential treatment followed by transitional housing support. The veteran was now employed and housed, and he volunteered with homeless outreach programs. An admissions counselor in Ohio shared the story of a teenager whose parents had exhausted their savings and retirement funds trying to pay for his previous treatment attempts. Matthew's payment for a long-term residential program had finally provided the intensive care the young man needed to achieve stable recovery. He was now in college and planning to become an addiction counselor. Every facility David contacted had similar stories, people whose lives had been fundamentally changed by treatment they never could have afforded without Matthew's anonymous generosity. But what struck David most was that none of these people knew who had helped them. They had been told that an anonymous donor had covered their costs, but they had no idea it was Matthew Perry. This is incredible, Matthew, David said during one of their planning meetings for the formal foundation. Do you realize that you've probably saved dozens of lives? Some of these people might have died without access to treatment, and they have no idea who helped them. Matthew's response revealed the deeper motivation behind his secret funding program. That's exactly what I wanted, he said. I've been in treatment facilities where there were people who were there because some celebrity or wealthy donor wanted to be thanked and recognized for their generosity, and that changes the whole dynamic. It makes it about the donor instead of about the person who needs help. Matthew explained that his own experience with addiction had taught him that recovery required a sense of personal agency and self-worth that could be undermined if people felt like charity cases or publicity props for wealthy benefactors. I wanted these people to feel like they earned their recovery, Matthew said. I wanted them to focus on getting healthy, not on being grateful to me. The whole point was for my addiction experience to help other people overcome addiction, not to make me feel good about myself. This philosophy had guided every aspect of Matthew's funding decisions. He had deliberately chosen smaller, lesser-known facilities that provided high-quality care, but didn't have the resources for extensive marketing or celebrity endorsements. He had prioritized people who had been turned away from other programs due to financial constraints, recognizing that the inability to pay for treatment was often the only barrier between someone and recovery. Most importantly, Matthew had followed up on every person he helped, not by contacting them directly, but by staying in touch with their treatment providers to monitor their progress and provide additional support if needed. David discovered that Matthew had funded extended care, sober living expenses, job training programs, and educational support for dozens of people whose initial treatment he had sponsored. Matthew, you've essentially been running your own private addiction recovery system for 3 years, David said. You've created a comprehensive support network for people who had nowhere else to turn. The formal establishment of the Anonymous Recovery Fund allowed Matthew to expand his efforts while maintaining the privacy and personal approach that he valued. David helped him develop criteria and application processes that would ensure the money went to people who truly needed it while maintaining appropriate oversight and documentation. By the time of Matthew's death in October 2023, the Anonymous Recovery Fund had helped 312 people access addiction treatment and recovery support services. The fund had grown to include not just treatment costs, but also housing assistance, job training, educational support, and family counseling services that address the broader impacts of addiction. David Chen continued managing the fund after Matthew's death, using the endowment Matthew had established to ensure the program could continue indefinitely. But he also made the decision to publicly reveal the scope of what Matthew had accomplished, believing that the story could inspire others to support addiction recovery efforts. Matthew Perry saved hundreds of lives and nobody knew he was doing it, David said when he first spoke publicly about the Anonymous Recovery Fund. He could have put his name on buildings or started a public foundation that would have gotten him credit and recognition. Instead, he chose to help people quietly, anonymously, because he understood that the best kind of help doesn't come with strings attached. The revelation of Matthew's secret funding program sparked a wave of similar initiatives from other celebrities and wealthy individuals who had been inspired by his example. But more importantly, it provided a model for how people with resources could support addiction recovery efforts in ways that truly serve the people who needed help rather than the people providing it. Maria Rodriguez, one of the 203 people whose treatment Matthew had funded, learned about his role in her recovery only after his death. She had completed residential treatment in 2021 and had been sober for over 2 years, believing that she had been helped by an anonymous charitable organization. When I found out it was Matthew Perry who paid for my treatment, I cried for hours, Maria said. Not because I was grateful to a celebrity, but because I realized that someone who understood exactly what I was going through had seen value in my life when I couldn't see it myself. He didn't know me, but he believed I was worth saving. David Chen's discovery of Matthew's secret payments revealed more than just financial transactions. It revealed a 3-year mission to turn personal suffering into collective healing, individual wealth into community support, and private pain into anonymous hope for hundreds of strangers who needed someone to believe in their recovery. Matthew Perry's accountant found $2.3 million in mysterious payments and discovered the most beautiful secret his client had ever kept. That sometimes the most powerful way to help people is to do it so quietly that they never know who helped them, allowing them to believe in their own strength rather than someone else's generosity.